Evan Carter stood alone in his penthouse, 38 floors above the glittering chaos of Chicago's Loop. The city sprawled out beneath him, Michigan Avenue's lights twinkling like a runway, the dark ripple of Lake Michigan catching the glow of a half-moon. He twirled a 6-carat emerald-cut diamond ring between his fingers, the one he'd slipped off Sophie Hayes's hand just hours ago. It felt heavier now than it ever had on her finger, like it was pulling him down into a life he didn't want anymore. His phone buzzed on the glass coffee table, another text from his father, Henry Carter. "Hayes deal's locked. Press release hits tomorrow at 8 a.m. Don't screw this up." Evan's jaw tightened. He wasn't thinking about the deal, or Sophie, or the empire he'd been groomed to run since he could tie his own shoes. He was thinking about Lila Brooks. Earlier that night, he'd seen her across a crowded community hall in Southside, her voice cutting through the murmurs like a blade. She stood under flickering fluorescent lights, her dark curls pulled back in a no-nonsense bun, pointing at a blueprint pinned to a corkboard. "This new Carter Enterprises tower isn't progress," she'd said, her brown eyes locking on his from 50 feet away. "It's another gut punch to Chicago's heart, displacing families, bulldozing history, all for some shiny condos no one here can afford." The room had erupted in applause, a few shouts of "preach" echoing off the peeling paint. Evan, in his tailored navy suit, had felt every word like a jab to the ribs. He'd gone there to defend his company's latest project, to play the polished billionaire smoothing over the locals' concerns. Instead, he'd left with her words ringing in his ears and a crack splitting through the life he'd built. The penthouse was silent now, save for the faint hum of traffic filtering up from below. Floor-to-ceiling windows wrapped around the living room, framing a view most people would kill for. Willis Tower piercing the skyline, the Ferris wheel at Navy Pier spinning lazily in the distance. The place smelled faintly of leather and cedar, all sleek lines and minimalist furniture, the kind of space Architectural Digest would drool over. But tonight, it felt more like a cage. Evan tossed the ring onto the coffee table with a soft clink, watching it skid across the glass. His reflection stared back at him, dark hair mussed from running his hands through it, green eyes shadowed with something he couldn't name. Guilt? Relief? Maybe both. He sank onto the gray sectional, elbows on his knees, and replayed the moment he'd walked away from Sophie. It had happened at the Drake Hotel, just before a press conference to announce the Carter-Hayes merger, a union of two Chicago dynasties that had been in the works since he and Sophie were kids trading juice boxes at country club picnics. She'd looked flawless as always, blonde hair swept into an elegant twist, her cream dress hugging her like it had been sewn onto her body. "Ready for the big show?" she'd asked, flashing that practice smile she'd perfected at Yale. He'd nodded, throat tight, and followed her into the oak-paneled suite where reporters were already buzzing like flies. But when she reached for his hand, something snapped. He couldn't do it. Not the photo op, not the merger, not the marriage. "Sophie," he'd said, voice low so the hovering assistants wouldn't hear. "I can't." Her smile faltered, blue eyes narrowing. "Can't what?" "This." He gestured vaguely between them, the ring catching the chandelier light. "Us. The whole damn thing." She'd stared at him, lips parting like she was waiting for the punchline. "Evan, we're 10 minutes from going live. What are you talking about?" "I'm talking about calling it off," he'd said, louder than he meant to. A PR flack in a cheap suit dropped his clipboard. "I don't love you, Soph. Not the way I should." The fallout had been instant. Sophie's face went from shock to ice in 3 seconds flat. "This isn't about love," she'd hissed, stepping closer so only he could hear. "It's about what we've built, what our families need. Don't you dare tank this over some midlife crisis." But he'd already pulled the ring from her finger, her nails scraping his wrist as she tried to hold on. He'd walked out past the gaping reporters, their camera flashes popping like gunfire, and driven straight home through a drizzle that streaked the windshield like tears he wouldn't let himself shed. Now, sitting in his too-quiet penthouse, Evan wondered how he'd gotten here. He wasn't some reckless dreamer. He was Evan freaking Carter, the guy who turned Carter Enterprises from a regional real estate giant into a national player in tech and green energy by 32. Business Insider called him a visionary. Forbes put him on their 40 under 40 list twice. His father had raised him on boardroom battles and balance sheets, dragging him to construction sites when other kids were at Little League. "This is your legacy," Henry would say, pointing at half-finished skyscrapers piercing the Illinois sky. "Your duty." Never once had he said your choice. And Sophie, she'd been part of the plan since they were teenagers, sneaking champagne at charity galas. The Hayes family owned half the shipping ports from here to New Orleans, and Sophie was the perfect match. Smart, poised, bred for this life as much as he was. They dated on and off, always falling back into step when their schedules aligned. It wasn't passion. It was compatibility, like pairing a good bourbon with a steak. Their engagement had made the front page of the Chicago Tribune's business section. Carter Hayes power couple set to redefine Midwest empire. The ring he'd picked, 6 carats, flawless, emerald cut, matched her perfectly. On paper, anyway. But paper didn't account for the hollow ache that had been growing in his chest for months. It didn't explain why, at 32, he felt more like a puppet than a king. And it sure as hell didn't explain Lila Brooks. He'd met her 3 months ago at a tech summit on Navy Pier, one of those overhyped events where startups pitched ideas to deep-pocketed suits like him. She'd been at a small booth near the back, no flashy holograms or buzzwords plastered on banners, just a laptop, a stack of printouts, and a quiet confidence that made people stop and listen. Lila Brooks, 29, founder of Green Horizon, a tiny outfit with a big idea. Software that could slash energy use in high-rises by 40%. She'd worn a simple black blazer over jeans, her voice steady as she explained how her tech could have saved Carter Enterprises millions on their last loop project. "Your lakefront tower is bleeding cash," she'd said, pointing at a 3D model on her screen. "My system catches that at the design stage." Evan had raised an eyebrow, half amused, half intrigued. "So you're saying I screwed up?" "No," she'd shot back, a smile tugging at her lips. "I'm saying you didn't have the right tools. Now you do." He'd stayed for an hour, canceling 2 meetings to pick her brain. She didn't kiss up to him like everyone else in his world, no Mr. Carter or nervous giggles. She just talked, sharp, direct, her passion for sustainable design lighting up her face in a way that made his pulse kick up a notch. When he left, her business card was burning a hole in his pocket, and he'd spent the drive back replaying her laugh instead of the quarterly projections he was supposed to review. That was the start. Quarterly check-ins turned into monthly lunches, then late-night texts about industry blogs or some new building code she'd found loopholes in. She saw the city differently. Where he saw profit margins and steel frames, she saw neighborhoods, people, stories. She'd grown up in Bronzeville, in a house her family lost when Carter Enterprises revitalized the area a decade ago. "You turned my block into a parking garage," she'd told him once over takeout in his office, her tone more resigned than bitter. It had hit him harder than any boardroom critique. Tonight, though, she'd been all fire. That meeting in Southside wasn't some polite pitch. It was a showdown. She'd called him out in front of a room full of folks who'd cheered her on, and he'd stood there, tie loosened, feeling like a kid caught cheating on a test. "I create jobs, Lyla," he'd argued, stepping closer to her booth. "You want me to apologize for that?" "No," she'd said, arms crossed, staring him down. "I want you to do better." Do better. 2 words that had followed him all the way back here, rattling around his skull as he ditched Sophie, the merger, the plan. His phone buzzed again. Henry, probably ready to chew him out. Evan ignored it, grabbing a beer from the fridge instead. The cold glass felt good against his palm as he stepped onto the balcony, the wind off the lake whipping through his shirt. Below, Chicago pulsed, taxis honking, L trains rumbling, a city he'd helped shape but never really known. Lyla knew it, and somehow she was making him want to know it too. He took a swig, the bitter taste grounding him. Tomorrow, the press would have a field day. His father would lose it. Sophie would. Well, he didn't know what Sophie would do. But for the first time in years, Evan didn't care about the fallout. He cared about what came next. Hey, if you've ever had to choose between what you want and what everyone else expects, you're not alone. Stick around to see where Evan's choice takes him. Hit that subscribe button and drop a comment with your thoughts. What would you have done in his shoes? The Drake Hotel buzzed like a kicked beehive. Evan stood in the grand foyer, the marble floor cool under his polished loafers, the air thick with the scent of lilies and expensive cologne. Crystal chandeliers dangled overhead, casting golden light across a sea of suits and sequined dresses. Chicago's elite, gathered for what was supposed to be the business event of the year. The Carter-Hayes merger announcement wasn't just a press conference. It was a coronation, a public sealing of 2 dynasties that had been whispered about in boardrooms and backrooms for decades. Reporters jostled near the velvet ropes, their microphones bristling like porcupine quills, while assistants darted around with clipboards and earpieces, barking orders into the chaos. Evan's tie felt like a noose. Sophie was a few feet away, radiant as ever, chatting up a Tribune columnist with that effortless charm she'd honed since prep school. Her cream dress shimmered under the lights, and the 6-carat ring, his ring, glinted on her finger as she gestured. She caught his eye and flashed a quick smile, the kind that said, "We've got this." Except he didn't. Not anymore. His stomach churned, a mix of nerves and something sharper, certainty maybe. He'd spent the night pacing his penthouse, Lila's voice looping in his head. "I want you to do better." By dawn, he'd known what he had to do. The merger, the marriage, the life laid out for him. It was a script he couldn't read anymore. He stepped toward her, weaving through a cluster of gray-haired execs sipping martinis. "Sophie," he said, voice cutting through the hum. She turned, eyebrows lifting slightly. "Ready?" she asked, smoothing her dress. They're about to call us in. No. He swallowed, the words sticking in his throat. I need to talk to you. Now. She frowned, glancing at the PR team hovering nearby, then followed him to a corner near a potted palm. The noise dulled to a background roar as he faced her, hands shoved in his pockets to keep them from shaking. I can't do this, he said. Her smile froze. Do what? The speech? You've got the notes. Not the speech. Us. He pulled her hand gently, sliding the ring off her finger before she could react. The engagement, the merger, all of it. Sophie's eyes widened, then narrowed to slits. Evan, we're 5 minutes from going live on every major outlet in the Midwest. What the hell are you doing? I'm telling you I don't love you, he said louder than he meant to. A reporter nearby dropped his pen, head snapping up. Not enough to marry you. I can't keep pretending. For a split second, she looked like she might laugh, like this was some prank he'd pull on her birthday. Then her face hardened, lips pressing into a thin line. This isn't about love, she whispered, stepping so close he could smell her Chanel perfume. It's about what we've built, what our families need. You don't get to tank this because you're having some existential meltdown. It's not a meltdown, he shot back, voice steady now. It's the truth. I'm done living for everyone else. She yanked her hand back, the ring dangling from his fingers like a grenade with the pin pulled. You're insane, she hissed. Do you know what this'll do to us? To Hayes Logistics? To your father? I know, he said, meeting her glare. And I'm sorry. Before she could respond, a voice boomed over the speakers. Ladies and gentlemen, please take your seats. The crowd surged toward the ballroom, dragging the moment with it. Sophie spun on her heel, storming off toward her team, her heels clicking like gunfire on the marble. Evan stood there, ring in hand, as heads turned and whispers spread like wildfire. A flash went off. Some photographer had caught the tail end of it. Great. By morning, this would be plastered across every newsstand from here to Milwaukee. He didn't wait for the fallout. He pushed through the double doors, past a stunned valet, and out into the damp Chicago night. The drizzle had thickened into a steady rain, slicking the streets and streaking the neon signs along Oak Street. He climbed into his black Tesla, the engine humming to life as he gripped the wheel, knuckles white. His phone was already blowing up. Texts from his assistant, missed calls from Henry, a curt, "Call me now," from his mother Claire. He silenced it, tossing it onto the passenger seat, and peeled out onto Lakeshore Drive. The city blurred past, taillights smearing red through the rain, the Hancock building looming like a judge in the fog. Evan's pulse hammered in his ears, drowning out the patter on the windshield. He'd just torched the perfect plan, the one he'd been bred for since Henry first handed him a toy hard hat at a construction site on the west side. Carter Enterprises and Hayes Logistics, a match made in corporate heaven, real estate and shipping, billions in assets, a legacy to carry into the next century. And he'd walked away from it in front of 200 witnesses. What the hell was he thinking? Lila's face flashed in his mind. Those sharp eyes, that half smile when she'd called him out last night. She hadn't just challenged his company, she'd challenged him. And instead of brushing her off like he would have a year ago, he'd listened. Really listened, For the first time in forever, he'd felt something real, not the polished satisfaction of a closed deal, but a spark, a pull, a question he couldn't shake. What if there's more? His phone lit up again, vibrating against the leather seat. This time, it was a news alert. Carter heir dumps fiancé, minutes before merger announcement. Chicago power couple implodes. He snorted, a bitter laugh escaping him. Leave it to the press to turn his life into a soap opera. By now, Sophie would be spinning damage control. Henry would be pacing his office at Willis Tower, and the board would be scrambling to figure out how bad the stock dip would be. He should have felt guilty. He didn't. He took the exit toward Wacker Drive, the river glinting black under the bridge lights. The rain drummed harder, matching the storm in his chest. Part of him wanted to call Lyla, to tell her what he'd done, to see if she'd get it. But what would he say? Hey, I just blew up my life because you told me to do better. Coffee? No, he needed to figure this out alone first. He pulled into a deserted parking lot near the river, cutting the engine. The silence hit him like a punch. Nothing but the rain and his own ragged breathing. Back at the Drake, the story was already spreading beyond the ballroom. Across town in Bronzeville, Lila Brooks sat in her cramped apartment above a bodega, scrolling X on her phone. Her sister Tanya burst through the door, rain-soaked and grinning, waving her own phone like a trophy. "You see this?" Tanya said, kicking off her boots. "Evan Carter just ditched Sophie Hayes. Live on camera. The whole merger's toast." Lyla frowned, setting her mug of tea down on the chipped Formica table. "Wait, what?" "Check the Tribune," Tanya said, tossing her jacket over a chair. "Mr. Billionaire walked out right before the big reveal. People are losing their minds." Lyla pulled up the article, her heart doing a weird flip as she skimmed the headline. She'd seen Evan less than 24 hours ago, sparring with him at that community meeting. He'd looked rattled when he left, but this was next level. Why would he do that? She muttered, more to herself than Tanya. "Who cares?" Tanya said, leaning over her shoulder. "Maybe he finally grew a conscience. Or maybe he's just nuts. Either way, don't let him drag you into his mess, sis. Guys like him don't change. They just play the game better." Lyla didn't answer, her thumb hovering over Evan's contact in her phone. She'd called him out, sure, but she hadn't expected this. Had she pushed him too far? Or had he actually heard her? She set the phone down, staring out the window at the wet street below, the bodega's neon sign flickering in the dark. Whatever Evan was up to, it wasn't her fight. Not yet. Back in his car, Evan tipped his head against the seat, rain streaking the windows like bars. He'd crossed a line tonight. No going back now. The city he'd helped build stretched out around him, cold and unforgiving. But for the first time in years, he felt awake. Scared as hell, yeah, but awake. Whatever came next, Henry's wrath, Sophie's revenge, the board's panic, he'd face it. Because walking away from that stage wasn't just about ditching Sophie. It was about choosing himself. The morning after Evan Carter walked out of the Drake Hotel, Chicago woke up to a media frenzy. The Tribune's front page screamed, "Billionaire heir dumps fiancé, threatens Carter Hayes' empire," complete with a grainy photo of him clutching Sophie's ring, rain streaking his face as he stormed out. X was worse. Hashtags like #CarterCrash and #Chicago Drama trending by 7 a.m. memes of Evan as a runaway groom popping up faster than he could mute his notifications. He sat in his penthouse kitchen, nursing a black coffee, the city's skyline a gray blur through the drizzle outside. His phone buzzed relentlessly on the counter. Henry's third missed call, a terse email from the board, a text from his assistant. "PR's in panic mode. Where are you?" He didn't reply. Let them stew. He'd deal with the mess when he was damn ready. Across town, Sophie Hayes wasn't waiting. She stood in her Gold Coast condo, floor-to-ceiling windows framing Lake Michigan's choppy waves, her phone pressed to her ear. "Miles," she snapped, pacing in bare feet, her silk robe swishing. "He didn't just ditch me. He tanked the merger. We need to hit back now." Her brother's voice crackled through, cool and clipped. "Already on it. I've got a guy at the Sun-Times ready to run a piece. Evan Carter's chasing some startup chick to polish his image. True or not, it'll stick." Sophie paused, nails digging into her palm. "Good. And find me someone on his board who's pissed enough to flip. I want him out." Miles chuckled. "Greg Lawson's been itching to stab him in the back for years. I'll make the call." By noon, the rumor hit X like a Molotov cocktail. Carter's breakup wasn't cold feet. Word is he's cozying up to a Southside architect to look woke. No names yet, but the implication was clear. Evan saw it on his phone as he grabbed a sandwich from a deli near Wicker Park, the cashier giving him a sidelong glance like he might bolt without paying. He scrolled, jaw tight, then shoved the phone in his pocket. Let them talk. He'd known this was coming. Sophie wasn't the type to slink off quietly, and Miles Hayes was a shark who'd smell blood in the water from a mile away. What he didn't expect was how fast it'd spiral. Meanwhile, in Bronzeville, the air crackled with a different kind of heat. Tanya Brooks stood on a makeshift stage at 47th Street, megaphone in hand, her braids swinging as she rallied a crowd of 50. Locals, activists, a few kids clutching protest signs. "Carter Enterprises thinks they can keep steamrolling us," she shouted, voice booming over the hum of traffic. "Their new tower's gonna gut our homes, our businesses, turn this into another playground for the rich. We say hell no." The crowd roared, fists pumping, signs bobbing. "Carter out of Chicago! And save our South Side!" Smoke curled up from a tire someone had set ablaze in the street, the acrid smell mixing with the damp chill of the March afternoon. Lyla watched from the edge, arms crossed, her green jacket zipped against the wind. She'd helped design the community center Tanya was fighting for, a squat brick building with a mural of jazz legends on the side, now slated for demolition under Carter's latest project. She'd only found out last week, digging through public permits after Evan mentioned the tower offhand. Her stomach had dropped then, and it was dropping now as Tanya's eyes landed on her. "You with us, sis?" Tanya called, lowering the megaphone. Lyla forced a nod, but her mind was a tangle. She'd spent months working with Evan, late nights over blueprints, takeout containers piling up as they hashed out ideas. He wasn't just some suit. He listened. He cared, or so she'd thought. But this felt like a betrayal. She pulled out her phone, hesitating, then texted him. "Did you know about the community center?" No answer. She shoved it back in her pocket, the crowd's chants ringing in her ears. Tanya hopped off the stage, boots thudding on the asphalt, and grabbed her arm. "Come on, we're marching to City Hall. You're not bailing, right?" "I'm here," Lyla said, voice tight. "But we need to talk about Evan." Tanya's face darkened. What's there to talk about? He's Carter Enterprises, Lyla. Same game, different smile. He's not like that, Lyla said, stepping closer. He's trying to change things. Change? Tanya cut her off, incredulous. He just blew up his engagement on live TV and now the whole city's a circus. Don't tell me you're buying his savior act. Lyla opened her mouth, then shut it. She didn't have an answer, not one Tanya would accept. The march kicked off, boots pounding pavement, and she fell in step, the weight of her sister's words sinking in. Evan had walked away from Sophie, sure, but what did that mean for her? For them? If there even was a them. Evan got Lila's text as he pulled into the Carter Enterprises garage downtown, the concrete echoing with the squeal of his tires. He stared at the screen, thumb hovering. Community center? He hadn't known. Henry handled the permits, the gritty details. But that didn't matter. He'd signed off on the tower, hadn't he? He cursed under his breath, slamming the car door. The elevator ride to the 38th floor felt like a trip to the gallows, the mirrored walls throwing back a guy who looked more wrecked than he'd admit, shirt wrinkled, eyes bloodshot from no sleep. Henry was waiting in his corner office, a cavern of glass and steel overlooking the loop. The old man stood by the window, hands clasped behind his back, his silver hair catching the gray light. "Sit," he barked without turning. Evan didn't. "You've seen the news," Evan said, leaning against the desk instead. "Seen it?" Henry spun around, face red. "I've got the board breathing down my neck, Hayes threatening to pull every deal we've got, and our stock's down 5 points already." "What the hell were you thinking?" "I was thinking I don't want to marry someone I don't love," Evan said, crossing his arms. "Or run a company that screws over half the city." Henry's laugh was sharp, bitter. "Love? This isn't some rom-com, son. This is about responsibility, legacy. You don't get to play rebel because you're bored." "I'm not bored," Evan snapped. "I'm awake, and I'm not letting you guilt me into this." Henry stepped closer, eyes narrowing. "You're out of your depth." "Sophie's already talking to Greg Lawson. Ring any bells? He's been gunning for your seat since you took over. And Miles Hayes is feeding the press garbage about you and some girl. You've handed them the knife, Evan." "Let them come," Evan said, voice low. "I'm done being your puppet." "You'll be done, period," Henry shot back. "No CEO spot, no trust fund, no Carter name. Walk away from this, and you're on your own." The words hung there, heavy as the steel beams framing the skyline outside. Evan held his father's stare, then turned and walked out, the door clicking shut behind him. His chest tightened as he hit the elevator again, the descent mirroring the free fall his life had become. Sophie and Miles were circling, Henry was drawing battle lines, and now Lyla. Lyla thought he'd lied to her. He pulled out his phone, typing a reply. "I didn't know. Meet me?" He hit send, hoping she'd give him a chance to explain. That night, the protest hit the news. Lyla saw it on her TV, grainy footage of Tanya leading the charge, cops in riot gear lining up near City Hall. The anchor cut to a shot of Evan leaving the Carter building, head down, captioned, "CEO under fire as protests erupt." Her phone pinged. His text. She stared at it, the room quiet except for the hum of the bodega sign downstairs. Tanya's voice echoed in her head. "Guys like him don't change." But Evan had changed, hadn't he? Or was she just seeing what she wanted to? Outside, the city simmered, rain on the streets, anger in the air. Evan drove aimlessly, the radio spitting static and news bites about his downfall. Sophie plotted in her condo, Miles dialed Greg Lawson, and Tanya rallied her troops. Lyla stood at her window, caught between two worlds, while Evan gripped the wheel, caught between the man he'd been and the one he might become. The storm was just beginning. Evan Carter hadn't slept in 36 hours, and it showed. His penthouse was a mess. Coffee mugs scattered across the counter, a half-eaten sandwich going stale on the table, papers strewn over the sectional like a tornado had hit. He stood by the window, staring at the Chicago skyline as dusk painted it in shades of orange and steel gray. The city looked calm from up here, but he knew better. Down there, the knives were out. Sophie and Miles sharpening theirs, Henry ready to carve him out of the family legacy. His phone sat silent now, battery dead after a barrage of calls he'd ignored. The quiet was worse than the noise. He'd spent the day digging, old emails, project files, anything to answer Lila's text about the community center. She hadn't replied to his "meet me." Not a word since last night's protest hit the news. He didn't blame her. He'd signed off on that tower without a second thought, trusting Henry's team to handle the details. Now he was neck-deep in permits and zoning maps, piecing together a puzzle he hadn't even known existed. That's when he found it. A buried memo from 6 months back, tucked in a folder labeled Hayes Logistics, Confidential. His gut twisted as he read. Port control secured via merger. Energy grid access prioritized. Carter assets leveraged for Phase 2. It wasn't just a marriage deal. It was a takeover. Evan sank onto the couch, the memo trembling in his hand. Henry and Miles hadn't been building a partnership. They'd been plotting to lock down Lake Michigan's shipping ports, using Carter Enterprises' green energy projects as a Trojan horse to corner the Midwest's clean power market. Billions were at stake, and Evan had been the pawn, the shiny CEO face to sell it to the board. The community center? Collateral damage. Bronzeville? Just another square on their chessboard. He dropped the paper, running a hand through his hair. Son of a bitch, he muttered, the words echoing in the empty room. He needed air. He grabbed his jacket and headed for the elevator, the memo stuffed in his pocket. The streets below buzzed with Friday night energy, taxis honking, couples ducking into bars along the magnificent mile. He walked fast. No destination, just motion to keep his head from exploding. The rain had stopped, leaving puddles that mirrored the neon signs, red, blue, green splashing across the wet asphalt. His mind raced. Henry had played him. Sophie had known, maybe not all of it, but enough. And Lyla, God, Lyla had been right all along. He ended up at a dive bar in Logan Square, a hole in the wall called the Owl with sticky floors, and a jukebox blaring Springsteen. He slid into a booth, ordered a bourbon, and pulled out his phone, plugged into a wall charger he'd begged off the bartender. He typed out a new text to Lyla. Found something big. Can we talk? Please. He hit send, staring at the screen like it might bite him. The bourbon burned going down, but it didn't dull the ache in his chest. If she didn't answer, he'd go to her. He had to. Across the city, Lila Brooks sat in her apartment, the TV muted on a news loop of Tanya's protest. The room smelled like chamomile tea and the faint tang of paint from a canvas she'd abandoned weeks ago. Her phone buzzed on the table. Evan again. She'd ignored his last message, too raw from Tanya's words, too torn about what she'd seen on the news. But this one felt different, urgent. She hesitated, then opened it. Found something big. Her pulse kicked up. Against her better judgment, she typed back, "Where?" His reply came fast. "The Owl, Logan Square." "I'll wait." She grabbed her coat, slipping out before Tanya could barge in and talk her out of it. The L train rattled her halfway across town, the lights of Chicago streaking past in a blur. She stepped into the Owl 20 minutes later, spotting Evan in the back, hair a mess, tie gone, a glass of amber liquid sweating in front of him. He looked up, relief flashing across his face. "You came," he said, voice rough. "Against my better judgment," she said, sliding into the booth. "What's this big thing?" He pulled the memo from his pocket, sliding it across the table. "Read this." She skimmed it, her frown deepening with every line. "Port control? Energy grid? What the hell is this, Evan?" "It's why the merger mattered," he said, leaning forward. "My dad and Miles Hayes, they weren't just linking companies. They were setting up a monopoly, using my green energy projects to do it. The tower, the community center, it's all part of their play." Lila's eyes snapped to his. "You're saying you didn't know?" "I swear I didn't," he said, hands flat on the table. "I trusted Henry. I was the idiot who didn't ask questions." She sat back, arms crossed, studying him. The bar's dim light caught the shadows under his eyes, the tension in his jaw. He looked like a man on the edge, but there was something else, something honest. "So what now?" she asked. "You gonna let them get away with it?" "No," he said, voice firm. "I want to stop them, but I need your help." "My help?" She laughed, sharp and short. "Evan, my sister's out there burning tires because of your company. I'm supposed to trust you now." "I'm not asking you to trust me," he said, meeting her gaze. "I'm asking you to help me fix this. For Bronzeville. For the city." The jukebox switched to a slow Tom Petty track, the bar's chatter fading into a hum. Lyla tapped her fingers on the table, weighing him. She wanted to walk away, to let Tanya be right about him, but the memo sat there, real as the chipped wood under her hands, and something in his voice, raw, desperate, kept her rooted. "Okay," she said finally. "But if you're playing me, Evan Carter, I'll burn your world down myself." He cracked a faint smile. "Deal." They spent the next hour hashing it out, Lyla pulling up public records on her phone, Evan sketching a plan on a napkin. They'd need proof, hard evidence beyond one memo, something to take to the press or the board. Lyla knew people in city planning who could dig up dirt. Evan had access to Carter's internal files. It was a long shot, but it was something. By the time they left, the bourbon was gone, and the night had turned cold, their breath fogging in the air outside. Evan walked her to the L station, hands in his pockets. "Thanks," he said, stopping under a flickering streetlight. "For not writing me off." "Don't thank me yet," she said, zipping her jacket. "We've got a war to fight." He nodded, watching her disappear up the stairs. The train rumbled off, and he stood there, the weight of the memo still in his pocket, the weight of her trust heavier still. He turned back toward his car, the city sprawling around him. Beautiful, brutal, and now a battlefield. Back at Willis Tower, Henry Carter stood in his office, the lights off, the skyline his only company. His phone buzzed. Miles Hayes. "Lawson's in," Miles said, voice smug. "Sophie's got him ready to call a vote. Evan's done." "Good," Henry said, staring at the river snaking through the city below. "He wants to play hero. Let's see how he likes losing everything." Evan didn't know it yet, but the clock was ticking. Sophie and Miles were closing in. Henry was pulling strings, and Lyla was his only shot at turning the tide. The bar's neon sign buzzed behind him as he drove off, the memo burning a hole in his jacket. He'd found the truth, but exposing it would cost him more than he'd ever imagined. The high came fast. Hope, adrenaline, Lila's fire beside him. But the crash was coming too. Evan's got the truth. But can he and Lyla take down the big dogs? The stakes just got higher. Subscribe now to catch the next twist, and let me know in the comments. Do you trust Evan to pull this off? Or is he in over his head? Evan Carter stood in the shadow of Willis Tower, the wind off the Chicago River cutting through his jacket like a blade. It was Monday morning. 3 days since he'd sat across from Lyla at the Owl, the memo still crumpled in his pocket. They'd been digging ever since. Lyla pulling strings with city planners, Evan sneaking files from Carter Enterprises servers late at night. They'd found more. Emails between Henry and Miles, shady contracts tying the tower project to port leases, numbers that didn't add up. It was a house of cards, and they were close to knocking it down. But close wasn't enough. Not when the city was turning into a war zone around him. His phone buzzed. Another news alert. Hayes Logistics heiress slams ex-fiancé on live TV. Evan Carter betrayed us all. He clicked the link, jaw tight, as Sophie's face filled the screen. She sat on a morning show set, poised in a navy blazer, her voice steady but sharp. "Evan's not just walking away from me. He's abandoning his family, his company, and everyone who depends on Carter Enterprises," she said, eyes glinting with something between hurt and venom. "He's chasing a fantasy, and we're the ones paying the price." The host nodded, sympathetic, as the ticker below flashed. Carter stock plummets 8% amid scandal. Evan shut it off, shoving the phone in his pocket. Sophie wasn't just spinning a story, she was swinging a wrecking ball. He headed for his car, parked in a garage off Wacker Drive, when another call came through. Greg Lawson, the board's resident snake. Evan answered, bracing himself. "Greg," he said, voice flat. "Evan," Greg drawled, smug as hell. "Rough week, huh? Thought you should know. The board's meeting tomorrow. Emergency session. Your dad's pushing a vote to kick you out." Evan stopped cold, keys dangling in his hand. "You're bluffing." "Am I?" Greg chuckled. "Sophie's got half of us on her side already. Henry's calling you a liability. Step down quiet, or we'll make it loud." The line went dead. Evan stared at the concrete wall, the hum of traffic overhead vibrating through him. His own board, his own father, turning on him. He'd known Henry was ruthless, but this was a gut punch. He climbed into the Tesla, slamming the door, and gripped the wheel until his knuckles whitened. The memo, Sophie's interview, Greg's threat. It was all closing in, a noose tightening with every move he made. Meanwhile, in Bronzeville, Lila Brooks sat in Green Horizon's tiny office, a converted storefront with peeling paint and a flickering fluorescent bulb. She was on the phone with a city planner when the door banged open, Tanya storming in like a hurricane. "You see this?" Tanya said, tossing a flyer onto Lila's desk. It was bold red, screaming, "Stop Carter! March on Millennium Park tonight!" Lila set the phone down, frowning. "Tanya, what's this?" "It's war," Tanya said, pacing. "Carter's tower permits just got fast-tracked. City Hall's in their pocket. We're hitting back, big this time. You in or what?" Lila's stomach dropped. "Tonight? Tan, we need more time." "Time?" Tanya cut her off, eyes blazing. "They're tearing down the community center next week. We've got no time." "And you're still playing nice with Evan Carter?" Before Lila could answer, her phone rang. Unknown number. She picked it up, cautious. "Lila Brooks." "Miles Hayes," came the smooth reply. "Heard you're the brains behind Green Horizon. I've got an offer. 10 million to buy you out. Cash, no strings. Say yes, and your little startup's set for life." Lila froze, Tanya's glare burning into her. "Why?" she asked, voice steady. "Let's just say I'd rather have you on my team than Evan's," Miles said. "Think it over. Clock's ticking." He hung up, leaving her staring at the screen. Tanya crossed her arms. Who was that? "Miles Hayes," Lila said, setting the phone down. "He wants to buy Green Horizon." Tanya's laugh was bitter. "Of course he does. Carter's cronies circling the wagons. You gonna sell out, sis?" "No," Lila snapped, standing. "But I'm not just gonna scream in the streets either. Evan's got proof. Real proof. That could stop this." "Evan." Tanya stepped closer, voice low. "He's why we're here, Lila. Wake up." Lila didn't flinch. "I'm awake, and I'm doing this my way." She grabbed her bag and walked out, leaving Tanya fuming. She texted Evan as she hit the sidewalk. "Hayes just offered me 10 mil. We need to move fast." His reply was instant. "Meet me at the Riverwalk, now." That night, the city erupted. Tanya's march swelled to hundreds, spilling from Bronzeville into Millennium Park. The bean glinted under floodlights as protesters chanted, drums pounding, signs waving like battle flags. Cops in riot gear lined up along Michigan Avenue, radios crackling, their shields catching the glow of burning trash cans. News choppers buzzed overhead, beams slicing through the smoke. Tanya stood on a bench, megaphone blaring. "Carter Enterprises doesn't own us. We fight tonight." The crowd roared, surging forward, then clashed. Batons swung, tear gas hissed, and screams cut the air. Evan and Lila met a mile away, on the Riverwalk near the DuSable Bridge. The water lapped dark and restless below, the city's chaos a distant rumble. He handed her a USB drive, his face drawn. "Everything's here. Emails, contracts, the works. Enough to bury Henry and Miles." Lila took it, her fingers brushing his. "You sure about this? Your dad's not gonna forgive you." "He already hasn't," Evan said, voice rough. "Board's voting me out tomorrow. Sophie's on TV calling me a traitor. It's over unless we hit first." She nodded, slipping the drive into her pocket. "I'll get it to my contact at the Tribune. But Miles, He'll ruin me if I don't sell. Then we ruin him first, Evan said, stepping closer. I'm with you, Lyla. All in. Her eyes searched his, the river's wind tugging at her curls. For a second, it was just them, the city fading, the stakes blurring. Then her phone buzzed. CNN. Protests turn violent in Chicago. Dozens arrested. She cursed under her breath. Tanya's out there. I have to go. Lyla, wait. Evan grabbed her arm, then let go fast. Be careful, please. She nodded, already moving. You too. Evan watched her disappear into the night, then turned back to his car. He drove toward the loop, the skyline looming like a judge. His phone lit up. Greg Lawson again. Vote set. You're done, Carter. He tossed it aside, the USB's twin burning in his glove box. Lyla had the press copy. This one was for the board. He'd fight, even if it meant losing everything, because losing her trust wasn't an option. Across town, Sophie watched the protest footage from her condo, a glass of Pinot in hand. Miles lounged on her couch, smirking. Told you, he said. Evan's sinking, and that Brooks girl's next. She'll sell, or we'll break her. Sophie didn't smile. She'd better. I want him to feel this. In Millennium Park, Tanya stumbled through the tear gas, coughing, her megaphone lost. Cops hauled her toward a van, zip ties biting her wrists. She shouted Lila's name into the chaos, but her sister was gone. The city burned around her, fires in the streets, sirens wailing, a helicopter's roar overhead. Evan sat alone in his car, parked on a bridge, the river black below. He'd lost the board, the merger, maybe Lyla too. The USB gleamed in his hand, his last card. He closed his eyes, the weight of it all crashing down, hope gone, fight fading, a man with nothing left but a truth no one might hear. Lila's running into the fire, Evan's on the ropes. Can they turn this around, or is it game over? Don't miss the next part. Subscribe now and tell me in the comments. Who's got the upper hand, Sophie or Evan? Evan Carter sat in his Tesla, parked on the DuSable Bridge, the Chicago River churning black beneath him. The city's lights flickered through the windshield, a kaleidoscope of red and gold blurred by the fog in his head. It was past midnight, the protests still smoldering downtown, the board's vote looming at dawn. His phone was a graveyard of missed calls. Henry, Greg Lawson, even Sophie. But he hadn't answered. The USB drive in his glove box felt like a loaded gun. His last shot at taking down the empire he'd once called home. Lyla had the press copy, but she'd vanished into the chaos of Millennium Park, and he hadn't heard from her since. He tipped his head back, eyes burning. This was it. Rock bottom, the edge of everything he'd built crumbling away. Then his phone buzzed, a text from Lyla. Tribune's running it. Check your email. His pulse kicked up. He fumbled for the charger, plugged in, and opened his inbox. There it was, a draft from the Tribune's lead reporter. Carter Enterprises CEO alleges fraud in Hayes merger. Exclusive docs reveal port scheme. Attached were scans of the memo, the emails, the contracts, everything he and Lyla had dug up. She'd done it. He exhaled, a shaky laugh breaking free. But it wasn't over. The board vote was hours away, and Henry would fight dirty to bury this. He started the car, peeling off toward Willis Tower. The streets were a mess. Barricades from the protests, cop lights flashing, the air still sharp with tear gas. He didn't care. He had one play left. Confront the board himself, USB in hand, before Greg and Henry could lock him out. The garage was empty when he pulled in. The elevator ride to the 38th floor silent, except for the hum of his own adrenaline. He stepped into the executive suite, the glass walls dark, and found Henry alone in his office, hunched over a laptop, a tumbler of scotch sweating on the desk. "Evan," Henry said, not looking up. "Come to beg?" "No," Evan said, tossing the USB onto the desk with a clatter. "Came to end this." Henry's eyes flicked to the drive, then to him, narrowing. "What's that?" "Proof," Evan said, voice steady. "You and Miles didn't just plan a merger. You embezzled millions from Carter Enterprises to fund it. Shell companies, fake leases, the works. It's all there. And it's hitting the Tribune tomorrow." Henry's face went still, then twisted into a sneer. "You're bluffing. You wouldn't tank your own company." "It's not mine anymore," Evan shot back. "You made sure of that. But I'm not letting you drag it, or this city, down with you." Henry stood, slow, towering over the desk. "You think you're some hero? You're a child throwing a tantrum. The board's voting you out in 6 hours. Sophie's got the press eating out of her hand. You've got nothing." "I've got enough," Evan said, stepping closer. "And I'm not alone." He turned and walked out, Henry's shout echoing behind him. The drive to Millennium Park was a blur. Evan weaving through detours, the USB's twin still in his pocket. He parked near the Bean, the steel sculpture glinting under floodlights, the protests' wreckage scattered around, charred signs, broken bottles, a lone shoe abandoned in the grass. Reporters swarmed the edges, cameras rolling, but Evan ignored them. He needed Lyla. She found him first, stepping out of the shadows near the Pritzker Pavilion, her green jacket streaked with soot. "You're here?" she said, voice hoarse from the gas. "You okay?" he asked, scanning her, eyes red, curls wild, but standing tall. "Barely," she said, a faint smile tugging her lips. "Tanya's locked up. Cops grabbed her an hour ago, but the Tribune's got it all. Your stuff, my contacts. It's live." He nodded, relief flooding him. "I saw. I'm hitting the board next. Henry's done." Her smile faded. Miles called again. Upped it to 15 million. Said he'd bankrupt Green Horizon if I don't take it. Evan's jaw tightened. He's scared. "We've got him." They stood there, the city's pulse thudding around them, sirens in the distance, the rustle of leaves in the wind. "Lyla," he said softer. "I'm sorry. For the center. For everything." She looked at him, long and hard. "Prove it," she said finally. "Not to me, to them." She nodded toward the park, the people still milling in the dark. The board meeting hit at 8 a.m., a packed room on the 38th floor, 10 suits around a mahogany table, Henry at the head, Greg smirking beside him. Evan walked in unannounced, USB in hand, a laptop under his arm. The room went quiet, eyes darting. "You're not welcome here," Henry snapped. Too bad, Evan said, plugging the drive in and pulling up the files. Before you vote, see this. Screens lit up. Emails, bank transfers, a recorded call of Miles bragging about bleeding Carter dry. Gasps rippled through the room. Greg's smirk vanished. Henry's face turned ashen. This is fraud, Evan said, voice cutting through the silence. Millions siphoned off, hidden in the merger. You kick me out, fine, but you're all complicit if you let this slide. A woman in a gray blazer spoke up, hesitant. Is this verified? Tribune's running it now, Evan said. Check your phones. They did. The room erupted. Shouts, phones buzzing, Henry slamming a fist on the table. You're ruining us, he roared. No, Evan said, calm. You did that. He walked out, leaving the chaos behind. By noon, the vote flipped. Henry was out, Evan reinstated, pending an investigation. The stock wobbled but held, the press spinning a new tale. Carter heir exposes corruption, saves empire. Lyla saw it on her TV that afternoon, back in her apartment, a mug of tea warming her hands. Tanya was out on bail, crashing on her couch, silent for once. The doorbell rang. Evan in a rumpled shirt holding a folder. The center's safe, he said, handing it over. New plans. Community first. Your design. She took it, flipping through. Her blueprints. Retooled. Funded. You did this? With you, he said, stepping inside. We're not done building. They sat on her fire escape that night, the city humming below. Lake Michigan a dark sheen, the L rattling past. I lost a lot, Evan said, voice low. Family's a mess. Some clients bolted. But this... He gestured at the folder, at her. This is worth it. Lyla leaned against the railing, the metal cold under her palms. Tanya still hates you, she said, half smiling. She'll come around, he said, or she won't. I'm not here for her. She met his eyes, the weight of the last week settling between them. Good, she said, soft but sure. Sophie left town a week later, spotted at O'Hare with a suitcase, Miles trailing her. Hayes Logistics reeling from lawsuits. Henry retreated to his Lake Forest estate, silent, the board cutting ties. Evan and Lyla kept going. Green horizon grew. Carter Enterprises shifted. New projects sprouting in Bronzeville, not over it. The city watched, some doors closing, others opening, unexpected ones, better ones. Evan stood on his penthouse balcony a month later, Lyla beside him, the skyline theirs now, not just his. I used to think success was numbers, he said, the wind tugging his words. Stock prices, square footage. I was wrong. Yeah? She said, nudging him. What is it then? He looked at her, the city sprawling beyond. This. Choosing what matters. Building something real. She smiled, full and bright. Took you long enough. They laughed, the sound carrying over the rooftops, a billionaire and an architect, rewriting the rules. The road hadn't been easy. Family ties frayed, battle scars lingered. But every loss carved space for something truer. Power wasn't control. It was courage. Wealth wasn't money. It was connection. And love? That was the hardest fight, and the only one worth winning. Evan and Lyla beat the odds. But what did it cost them? That's the end of their story. Subscribe for more real tales of grit and heart, and tell me in the comments. What's your takeaway from their fight? What would you have risked for a shot at something real?